Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Welcome to another episode on the Brain People Podcast. My name is Dr. Katie Crews. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, your host for today, and joined by my co-host,
Amanda Anguish, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist.
Now, we're talking about something that you have a lot of experience in, not personal experience, maybe just professional, unless there's a confession that you have for us today.
Not today. Maybe another day, but not today.
We're talking about anger management. What made you want to talk about this, Amanda?
Well, not that I don't see this every day in my practice here, but I also used to see this perpetually when I worked in a group home with at-risk teens, and I taught an anger management group. And the kids would often tell me, I would ask them how they're feeling, and I could tell from their body that they were definitely not happy. They were quite angry, rageful, wrath was everything they were experiencing, and yet they would say things like, I'm fine. And I could tell by their body language that they were not, in fact, fine, that they were upset, but I realized they didn't want to admit that they were angry.
Yeah, so it's helpful for our listeners, whether or not they actually think they're fine, and maybe this is a bit of awareness, but also maybe sometimes people know I really do struggle, and then what do I do? Because it's a very big emotion.
Yeah, I think I want to take some of the stigma away from anger because we have kind of all or nothing thinking when it comes to anger. Like it's either all bad or I should be angry and I can say whatever I want and do whatever I want. I think there's a happy medium in there that if we understand anger better, then we can understand where it might be helpful, where it might be hurtful in our lives, and then we can balance our lives better.
And it's a common emotion that we experience, whether we want to or not. And then it's a very common emotion we're experiencing currently.
Yes.
And
what are you speaking of, Katie?
I mean, it's you can just see that there's an increase with anger and an inability to manage that anger. And yes, it may apply to, we were having a conversation earlier about the politically charged climate, but also you see it being, disruptive to families, to relationships, to workplaces, road rage, and really drastic actions that come as a result of anger. And so I think it's a very, very much needed topic.
I noticed it was building up and building up in our society more so when I probably did something I shouldn't. And I started reading comments after news articles, after YouTube videos that I might have watched, even just any article that was out there. Even in the news, you'll notice that we're given the option of sharing our opinions. And a lot of the opinions that we're seeing are quite negative and very polarizing, even stories that we might read about. And then people will give their comments. And there's a lot of anger that's coming out. Even if you don't see their body language as it's happening, you can see we're becoming more and more angry as a society.
And part of it is because we just don't know how to regulate it. And I think generationally it's increasing, but also personally and individually.
And maybe we're even being incited to anger and we don't realize it, how our society is working, to get some people to be more on this side of a situation or issue than, let's push these people over this way. And we don't realize that maybe there's some manipulation happening too to separate us as a society. That could be a more spiritual topic that we could cover later. But I want people to have a better understanding of what anger is and also understand how they can manage it in a better way. And I know this is a often talked about issue. It's not like this is the first time people are going to hear something about anger, but I think there's some new things that we might hear today and some considerations that we might make a little bit differently too than maybe we have before.
So let's start with kind of more of a self-awareness opportunity for people to kind of really start reflecting, do I struggle with anger?
Yeah. Or maybe somebody in my life, do they struggle with anger too? It sure seems like they're angry, but I don't want to suppose that they are having an anger issue. So I have some questions that our listeners can do, and just make a little mental note or a little tally every time you can say yes to any of these. So the first one is, I believe I should get the credit I deserve, and I often hyper focus on that. Like, I need to get credit for this. Or if someone teases me or makes a joke at my expense, I tend to lose my temper. I have become so mad, I have broken things. I have many arguments with members of my family. This was one I saw in the group home quite a bit. I black out or lose control when I get triggered. I lash out when people don't do what I expect. That can be service workers, maybe you're at a restaurant. I have trouble thinking and instead just react when things don't go my way. I tell people exactly what I think of them when they annoy me. Any kind of disrespect, even when it isn't intentional, makes me mad. This is a big one. I harbor grudges and can't stop thinking about them. I often act angrier than I'd like to admit. I have or come close to hitting a person. People close to me often comment on how badly I handle my anger. People close to me say I'm really stubborn and have trouble compromising. And the last one, I'm quite critical of others.
I thought I was waiting for one that would say something along the lines of, I get really upset when I'm driving.
Yes. That might be in the I lash out when people don't do what I expect.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us, rest in peace, Grandma, didn't like the way people drove very often. And so we would sit in the back seat and we'd often be thinking, why is my grandma so upset? They can't hear what she's saying about them, but we can. And so, yeah, any of these things or all of these things might be an indication that you have an issue. Not you, Katie, but
Yes.
a listener might have an issue with anger and might want to look into maybe managing it better.
And I appreciate this because we sometimes have a stereotypical view of anger, but I notice that it provides some kind of gray areas where it might be resentment, it might be annoyance, or kind of those other levels of anger and different intensities of it, but also different situations that are not as obvious to us.
And some of these are more physically, so we are physical, we see these things outrightly, but others of them, only I'm going to really know because only I can answer that question because it's something going on inside of me too. Not everybody's going to know if I've almost hit somebody, but they would know if I did actually hit somebody.
True. Now, what exactly is anger?
So a lot of times people will hear that anger is a surface emotion. And there's even pictures, you can find them on the internet, that show like the anger iceberg, where on the surface is anger, but underneath that anger is all these emotions. And it could be, maybe I'm angry because really deep down I'm lonely and I feel abandoned. Or maybe I'm angry because I'm depressed and I'm not getting better, or I don't see, a sense of hope in my future. It could be angry because I feel fearful all the time and there's anxiety building up. So, or even, another big one too is even anger due to shame. So maybe I think I've done something wrong or I am something wrong, and so I'm angry on the surface, but really deep down what that anger is covering is a deep sense of, I'm not good enough.
And why would that be at the surface? What function does anger, what role does it play?
Well, sometimes it's a protective mechanism. We put that out there so people don't see those other things. We're afraid to show those other things. And, sometimes people will say certain genders or a certain gender is more likely to be like men or more likely to be angry because that's more appropriate to be angry versus to say, hey, I'm really lonely and I'd like to have company right now. And it feels like nobody's paying attention to me.
Yeah, because what you described is the underneath the surface emotions are very vulnerable. And I've known many of my clients who have said that they realized at some point, wow, anger is powerful. Anger is big. Anger, I can get what I want, and I can hide my shame, my disappointment, my hurt. And so it's very enticing to resort to anger.
Well, and think about our culture too. You don't often watch movies where men are talking about their feelings and that sort of thing and overcoming, difficult times in their life by talking about it and expressing those things. What we see is they become some renegade person and go out there and fight people, and it's very physical, and you see the anger and the rage going on, and then they win the fight, and then it's like, hurrah for the victor, good job, but it doesn't address the deeper stuff underneath.
And we even see that being encouraged for women.
Yeah, and now it's becoming more and more for women too. We often see that now for women, and sometimes it's like, well, if you can be angry, so can I, and I'm going to show you how angry I am.
Now, that can be very external, but what can also be other kind of signs or indications of anger more almost internally?
Yeah, so even though anger is often suggested to be a surface emotion, I've also seen where it's underneath the surface too. So sometimes people, we might say they play nice. On the surface, they're friendly, they're kind, they're generous, but underneath, you see these things play out and you think, why is this happening? And it can come out in things like sarcasm. So I'm being funny, but wait, that last little part that you said, that really cut deep and it hurt, and it didn't seem like it was just a joke. So that can be something. Another thing that it can look like is even excuses. Sometimes we might be angry underneath, and so we make excuses. And I'm thinking of a specific situation where I could tell a client of mine was very angry, and I was asking them to do something for me in my group. And rather than do that thing, oh, well, I'll do it later, or I'll try, or something. And I realized that was a sign of anger. They're making excuses so they don't have to give in because there's something that they don't want to do that they think maybe I'm pressuring them to do. And rather than say, hey, I don't like that you're pressuring me in that, or I don't like it when people pressure me in general, I didn't get around to it. Sometimes it even shows up in sickness. So say, for instance, I put myself out there all the time. I don't think that I'm getting the credit I deserve, so I play sick. And I want to take back that I play sick, because sometimes most of the time, I believe it's not always something that we do consciously, but maybe it becomes a way that because all of that anger is building up inside of me, I'm not expressing it in healthy ways, that it actually makes me sick. So it can be headaches, it can be stomach aches, it can be even depression. It can look like that, or lack of motivation. And so I might be sick a lot, and it's not necessarily a biological issue. It's something that comes from the anger that I'm not addressing. And so it keeps wearing itself on me.
And one that's kind of related to the sarcasm too, which I think is one that we can often see, is passive aggressive communication and behavior.
Yeah, passive aggressive can be things like gaslighting. It can be, oh, I would do that if you said this, if you said it this way or something, rather than saying, I would really like you to say it this way, or can you say please, and then I'd be happy to do it. Oh, well, you never say it the way I want you to. And that's what we mean by passive aggressive. And there's different ways of being passive aggressive. Sarcasm, just like I said, was one of them. Backhanded compliments, giving a compliment but kind of taking it back in a way. Withholding, like, I'm not going to do that unless you do this. A procrastination too, putting things off, can be a form of anger. Sometimes that happens with kids. When they're angry at their parents and they don't know how to use their words to express how they're feeling, then they might procrastinate because this is a way I can prove to them that I don't like this. And my parents get upset, and they, can't stand me that I'm doing this, but this is my power. And that's usually what these passive aggressive things are. It's trying to get back your power when you feel like you've lost it.
Now, for anger, thinking of like people who have more chronic issues, not just in a moment, where do you think that comes from? If someone's trying to understand themselves more, not just, oftentimes with anger management, we do just kind of stay at the surface as well and talk about, okay, now do this. But for the listeners that want to maybe self-reflect a little bit more or explore, are there typical patterns that we see of what people experience that might result in more chronic anger issues?
Yeah, so chronic anger can often be a sign of trauma. Maybe I wasn't allowed, maybe, I experienced abuse when I was growing up. It could be mental, physical, sexual neglect, that sort of thing. And, when you're young, you don't either have the words to express it or you're afraid to share the things that are on your heart and that anger that might be building up or that remember it's a surface emotion. So the neglect, the loneliness, the sadness, the lack of power, that sort of thing. And so anger becomes a way that we sort of protect ourselves. And then it becomes our only way of protecting ourselves, even when it sabotages certain areas of our lives. And we react to things. It's, I've seen quite a few times with clients who've experienced usually chronic trauma, that they'll jump to conclusions. Well, and they'll react like in a moment. You just said this. Why did you say it that way? Well, what they're doing is trying to protect from getting hurt. So they're anticipating what might hurt them so that they can get that person before that person gets to them.
And I think another thing to add on to that, in addition to trauma, which is a common thing, is the trauma that happens in seeing anger and having an environment that models that. And so if that's all you know too, that's how you have learned to deal with certain things by saying dad or mom.
Yeah, that's normalized. And I saw that a lot in the group home. I'm glad you mentioned that because most of the kids I was working with, it's not that they hadn't ever seen anger. That's all they saw because that's what their parents were doing. That's how even their grandparents that weren't, strong enough to hurt anybody necessarily, but they'd say things and they'd do things. And then all of their peers were fighting. And it's just, well, this is just what we do. If you look at me the wrong way, I hit you because that's how you respond to that, not realizing that, oh, that's not how you respond. And my favorite part of doing the group was when some of my kids would, they'd be acting up in the group and I'd have to push the group to the next week and they'd have to stay in it longer if we couldn't get through the material. And sometimes I'd have a new kid that was acting up. And the other kids who knew me would say, oh, you better stop it. She's upset or she's angry right now. And I would watch them start arguing with each other. She's not angry. She didn't say anything, in an angry way. And she didn't yell or that sort of thing. And they're like, oh no, she's really angry right now. She's going to make us do this next week if you don't shut up. And, that sort of thing. They said a lot of other things worse than that. And I would love watching it because what were they doing? They were recognizing there's other ways to express anger versus just yelling, punching, destroying property. And that's something that happens, like you said, when we grow up in an environment where that's all we see. So it was almost the lesson that I wasn't teaching that they got to learn anyway.
Is anger ever good? Because we often paint it and we're also kind of already painting all the negative. Is it ever good?
I believe it is. And I think there's some very good justification for that. And maybe our listeners can put themselves in a situation to see how that would look. If I have a child that, say my child is going to school and that child is being bullied, and I see that child come home every single day, and maybe they're hurt, maybe they're telling me, hopefully they're sharing with me what's happening, and I realize, wow, there's a problem at school that's happening and it doesn't seem to be taken care of. Nobody seems to be intervening to support my child or to help my child. I might find myself very angry. I would hope somebody would be very angry. Now, here's the thing though. Anger is not the problem. It's what we do with anger. And while one parent might go and, teach their kid to you punch them in the face and you show them, and I'm going to teach you all these, tools, or not healthy tools, or I'm going to go to the school and give that teacher a piece of my mind and, get them fired or something like that because they're not taking, doing any kind of intervention. On the other hand, the parent could sit down with the child. That anger could precipitate sitting down with the child and realizing, wow, this is a really big issue. There's so many different facets of this issue. Let's look at them and come up with a plan. And then that plan, rather than winding you up in jail, can actually help your child. Maybe you can teach them some skills or how to, stand up for themselves in certain situations. Maybe talk to somebody or ask the child, what do you think might help that I could support you in doing? And maybe we can work at it together. That's a very different response to anger versus just, we usually go from 0 to 60. We go, I'm angry, let me hit somebody, or I'm angry, let me yell at somebody. But that's not what anger equals. Anger is the emotion. It's the behavior that you do with it that makes the anger either beneficial or not. And the Bible tells us to not let the sun go down on our anger. So essentially, we're to do something with it.
The be angry and do not sin, right? Separates, I think, in a good way. What you're talking about is you can have the anger as the emotion, but not have the behavior.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that we often forget, that anger doesn't always beget some unhealthy consequence. Sometimes anger can be a great catalyst for good changes in the world. And I think we have a lot of evidence in history of people who've taken their own anger, rightful, justified. There's even a term called righteous indignation. And that's the idea that it's anger for a righteous cause.
And I often teach my clients, one of the roles of anger is perceived injustice and then motivation to correct the injustice. And when you view it in that way, of course, I would want to help my child or someone else's child that's getting beaten, right? Whenever we see wrong, and this is part of our climate today where we do see wrong happening. But at the end of the day, what do we do with that anger? How can we channel in a way that's actually productive and not harmful?
I like to think of our emotions, including anger, as signs. They're just giving us an indication of maybe what's up ahead or what's been happening behind us, or maybe at the speed that we should be going in the midst of it. But emotions aren't bad. It's what we do with them that affects them, good or bad.
Yeah. So what do we do with anger?
Okay.
How do we manage it?
So the first thing that we should do is actually start to recognize what is even bothering us. If any of our listeners have seen our ABCs of CBT episode, the first thing in that is activating events. We can't do anything about our anger if we don't even realize what's causing us anger. And sometimes that anger has been overwhelming us so much that we haven't stopped to even ask ourselves, what is causing this anger? It could be stuff in the past that's affected me and I'm being triggered by current things that remind me of that. It could be just my perception of things, like this is a bad thing, but I need to understand where this anger is coming from, or else I'm just going to be consumed by it.
Sit down with your anger, interview the anger, understand what job it's trying to perform.
Why are you here? Why are you at my door? What do you want from me? That sort of thing. The other thing too is recognize how anger affects you physically. Sometimes we don't even know it's triggering us because we don't even see it happening in our bodies. And unfortunately, if we've felt anger maybe most or all of our lives, we don't even realize that our bodies are taking in this anger and expressing it because that's all we know. That's just our baseline and we don't know it. So recognizing, are my fists clenching when my fists are clenching, what's happening when my fists are clenching? I would see my kids in the group home often. They didn't like to go see their psychiatrist because it usually meant a lot of medications that they were put on. And I would watch them clench their fists, and they would even start to pound their fist into their hand. And I think, oh no, what's going to happen? They didn't even recognize it though. That was just a normal automatic thing that they would do. But if they could see that, or maybe tension in our body somewhere, maybe a stomach ache, maybe that anger is a sign of anxiety or something that I have, that I feel helpless in a moment. So all of these physical things can be a sign, and then I can connect them to maybe what's causing it in the first place. Another thing is the toolbox. Like, have a toolbox for yourself when you're doing it. I know you like toolboxes or tools for when you teach DBT and that sort of thing, but we should have tools for everything that we're going through. And even anger can be something that we work through with the tools that you have too. But some specific ones that I like is breathing. Sometimes we get so caught up in the emotion that we forget to breathe. And if you're not supplying oxygen to your brain and your body, it's that much easier for you to just go in a fit of rage or anger and respond to things that way, or react to things that way. Another thing is gratitude. It's really easy to focus on the negative things that are happening, which builds the anger. But when you start to deviate from all of the negative stuff and you start to think, okay, what am I actually grateful for today? What is working well? Well, okay, fine, I had a good breakfast. Well, that starts to change the mental attitude, and I'm not so susceptible to anger like I was before. I like, for those who like mantras, one of my favorites is you can get a cactus, but you don't have to sit on it. So I can have that mantra so I don't keep venting and wallowing in that thing that was difficult or bad to create anger. And many people too really like to utilize Bible verses. If you don't know, there's quite a few Bible verses that deal with anger. We'll go through some of those later. I also like thinking of your response to anger as like a stoplight. And so the red is the stop, the yellow is the think. I'm going to slow down and think about this first. And then the green is I'm going to choose the right response to this situation. And that keeps us from reacting versus responding to something with a helpful mindset. Another one, avoid angry music.
I'm glad you included this one.
Oh man, I see this so often. And it's one of those scenarios where sometimes the what we want to call cure actually keeps the problem happening more. So, sometimes I might be depressed and I want to eat a cookie or a bunch of sugar, and it makes me feel good initially, but then it depresses me even more that I'm not taking better care of myself. I might be gaining weight or out of shape. And that's the same with anger and music too. Sometimes we listen to angry music because it actually causes an adrenaline response, which can be quite addictive and euphoric in the moment, but all it does is perpetuate the anger because the music is actually getting our heart rate to go at a certain rate that's not healthy, or the words are even perpetuating thoughts that we wouldn't necessarily think without that music telling us those things. And by the way, negative and angry music is a lot more popular than happy because more people feel angry in this day and age, and it's so sad. We don't want to do that to ourselves. So while it may make us feel good in the moment, it's not actually helping us. And I like Proverbs 22:24. It talks about not making friends with angry people. Sometimes it's not friendship in terms of just the people you hang out with, although that is a good way to think about it. But sometimes we make friends with the music that we listen to, the movies that we watch, the video games that we're involved in, and we don't realize those have become our new friends, but they're all foundationally angry.
And as they say, right, we're the sum of our friends, the people or the experiences that we spend the most time with.
Absolutely. Another thing in the toolbox is taking a time out. It's okay to walk away and tell people, I'm having a really difficult moment right now. I'm going to take 10, 15 minutes. People on this podcast have probably heard me say this before. It's one of my favorite ones. I'm going to step away and I'm going to come back better as I process some of these things. But sometimes when we keep ourselves in the situation where maybe we're being inundated over and over and over again, to step away gives us a better chance to think about things too. Learn to laugh. Sometimes we take things so seriously, But laughter is good medicine, the Bible also says. And so sometimes that can be good medicine even for the things that cause me anger. And reframing is another thing. Learn to challenge yourself to think about things differently than you usually do. Instead of saying, why does that person always have to be on my case about this? What is wrong with them? Don't they have anything else to do with their time? Maybe start recognizing, wow, that's attention that they're giving me. Maybe that attention comes from a place of love. Maybe they're not always the best at expressing that love, but it does come from a place of love, and I can't be too hard on them. At least they're giving me some attention and they want the best for me. That's another way of looking at it. I do want to say some things because sometimes people will say, oh, well, what about venting? We love to talk about things over and over and over again, but that actually precipitates more anger. It's like adding fuel to the fire rather than, taking the oxygen out of the fire. So we don't want to do that. And another one that sometimes we'll say too is like punch a pillow or punch a punching bag. And while that might feel good in the moment, sometimes that actually perpetuates more anger too. Like we get the euphoria of getting out our anger rather than maybe a more beneficial way of doing that. And I'm not going to say, if you're going to punch somebody, punch the pillow instead.
The lesser of two evils.
The lesser of two evils. But don't just use that as the only way that you
Find
respond.
another way to get your energy out.
Yeah, find another way, like exercise or, watching something maybe that makes you laugh, or talking to somebody that would be a better way, or even asking somebody, what's another way I could look at this? Like, help me with this. I trust you. You have good judgment. What's another way I could look at this? Another one that I think can be quite helpful too is refocus. Sometimes what happens is we become addicted to our anger. We're just looking for things to fuel that because remember, we get that, adrenaline response, and it can be quite addictive. That's why we call them adrenaline junkies. And so we're just looking for things to fill that. But there are some more healthy distractions that we can do besides looking for things like journaling. Like process some of my thoughts, slow them down. That's one of the beautiful things about journaling is it actually slows your thinking down so you can process things better. You can count, play with a pet. By the way, playing with a pet can be really great oxytocin too, to help you with that anger. And one of my favorite things I think that is especially helpful is actively listen. One of the reasons we're often angry is because we're actually jumping to conclusions and thinking we know what somebody is saying or meaning rather than really listening to what is happening. And it would be very embarrassing to find out later, oh, I just went to all that effort to get back at them or say whatever, and then maybe watch it in a playback or hear somebody else tell you that's not what they were saying, but you couldn't hear it because you were so adamant that this was happening instead. And I like James 1:19-20. It tells us to be quick to listen and slow to anger and react. So we do want to pay attention, listen for the words, because maybe people aren't as bad as you're suspecting they are. Another strategy that I think is especially helpful is boundaries. I've heard it said that when you find yourself angry and upset, look for a way that you haven't set a boundary. Because oftentimes what we're doing is it comes from boundaries, I think, are expectations. And when I expect people to act a certain way, but they don't know that I expect that, how can I blame them for not doing things if I haven't even expressed what my expectation of them is? And so oftentimes that anger comes from a place of they're not the perpetrator. Maybe I am because I'm blaming them for, going against my boundary or whatever it might be. They're taking advantage of me, but I've never said no.
Yeah, it's like the quote that says, stop asking why they keep on doing it and ask why you keep on allowing it.
Yes. So, I think it's like, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. why do I keep letting those people in my life? Or why do I keep letting that person do that thing? Maybe it's because I haven't expressed. And sometimes anger can be from a place of fear. I don't feel like I can, or I'm fearful that if I express something that person won't do it. So I just get angry because I never talk about it with them. So I think that's important. And the next one is see your trigger differently. Sometimes we focus on the monster versus the person. And we make our enemies 2-dimensional versus 3-dimensional. And a lot of people, maybe just like us, are struggling with things too. And we're putting more expectation on them than we even put on ourselves. And so sometimes if I can see my trigger differently, if I can undemonize the person and see them as a human being that might be frail in certain ways, might be strong in certain ways, and be able to see that person differently, that can also help me with my anger as well. And then the last one is something that we talk a lot about on our podcast. Start taking care of yourself. It's going to be a lot easier to be angry if you're not sleeping properly.
True.
Or if you're getting lack of sleep. It's going to be a lot easier to be angry when you're eating foods that upset your digestive system, and that's going to have effect on the rest of you. It's going to be a lot easier to, be angry when your life is out of control because you lack discipline in certain areas and you feel like, oh, why is this happening? Then it's so easy to project that anger on other people as though they're doing it to us, when in fact, maybe I'm not taking good enough care of myself. And if I did, I wouldn't have this struggle with shame or guilt, and I wouldn't be lashing out at other people too. So focusing on even discipline and taking care of yourself is probably, I think, that's sort of like the basic thing. It's like when your printer doesn't work or doesn't seem to be functioning and somebody says, "Did you turn it on?" And you're like, "Oh, oops, the plug isn't in," or something like that.
First things first.
Yeah, first things first. Take care of yourself. And then you might actually notice the other things aren't as big of a deal because you're eating right, you're exercising, you're sleeping right, and all those.
And I think a big part of that last piece, as well as boundaries, is taking control, period. I know a lot of people with their anger, it's a sense of helplessness.
Yeah.
And so if I feel like everyone else is to blame, right, then I'm off the hook. And so like I have a patient I can think of right now where just angry at so many things in life and the venting, the frustration. And so a big part is like, okay, every time you talk about something that you're angry about, immediately what's in your control and what action can you take? Oh, that person frustrated me. Okay, what are you going to do about it? Okay, I'm going to write a letter of complaint, against whatever the situation is in a work environment. Or, oh, that I'm so angry that I have this physical health condition. Okay, is there anything in your control? Oh, I can actually reverse that, or I can.
Yeah.
So anger is so much of anger can be resolved if we actually take action for the very things that we're complaining about.
And like you just said, that anger is a sign of a place in my life where I need to fix something. So if we're angry at our kids, well, maybe I need to be a better disciplinarian. I say what I want them to do, but I don't follow through on the actual discipline. And that's why I'm so frazzled all the time, because they're not listening to me. Or maybe, my husband comes home too late and I'm angry at him, but I've never said, hey, is there any way that you could cut your day shorter or bring some work home with you and I can help you, but it would just be nice to spend time with you, rather than, why do you always come home late? That sort of thing. We don't often realize that anger is a sign that something is not working and that we do have the ability to fix it.
And then the other thing that I tag on to, which I'll do a whole episode on, it's related to DBT, is radical acceptance. Mm-hmm. That in of itself, although it's a skill, it's really kind of a mindset. And I think it complements well of like, okay, you take control, but then radical acceptance really helps with the areas of our lives where we really are not in control.
Yeah.
And we need to accept there are drivers that will cut in front of me. There are people that will step over my boundaries. There are people I don't like. There are things I don't like about myself and I'm angry towards myself. And we just have to accept this is life. There's a lot of things to be angry about in life.
And I love that kind of goes under see your trigger differently, because I love doing groups, because that's something that you realize somebody might vent in the group that, oh, can you believe this happened? And you see everybody else's eyes light up like, oh, I'm not the only one that happens to. And then they start talking and they realize, oh, this isn't just the universe out to hurt me. This is a normal human thing that when I call customer service that they don't pick up right away, or I get the runaround and they, deter me off to somebody else who can't help me either. Those are normal human things that we all experience. And I love telling my clients, oh yeah, that happened to me the other day too. And they're like, oh, you mean you have to deal with this stuff? I'm like, yes, this is human stuff. But if we don't talk about it, then if we don't acknowledge what's going on and talk about it, we don't even realize that. So I think being a therapist is awesome, because you start to realize, oh, all the stuff I experience on a daily basis, my clients are all going through that too.
True. And I think there's just a big element of anger that we're fighting reality.
Yeah.
And if we just start accepting reality, it is what it is, right? We don't like what maybe is happening in our country right now. It is what it is, right? Now, can we channel some of that into what we can do? Great. But we need to accept what we can't. Because really, how productive is anger when we can't do anything about it and when we hold on to that anger? And that's where we see so much. I see it for my clients. They're struggling with their anger. They're holding on to it, and it's just eating them, right? Anger's good, but when it doesn't have a role or something that can be used in a way that would be productive, it's really damaging.
Yeah, anger can be one of your closest friends or your biggest enemies, depending the way that you look at it, because anger can be a sign of opportunities for great victory over difficulties, or it can be something that impedes you and stops you, or
has a victory over you.
Yeah, has a victory over you. And I think we all have the ability to have victory over our anger.
Amanda, any takeaways with all your professional experience with anger?
Don't sit on your cactus. That's the best I can do right now.
Okay, yeah, I think that's great. So,
yep.
A metaphorical cactus, of course, but thank you, Amanda, for sharing on a very important topic, very practical, something that we all need, whether it's a little bit of frustration or annoyance or irritation that you might struggle with, or bigger emotions of anger and rage, something that we all need, especially today. And so thank you, Amanda, for sharing.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe. Your engagement will help us reach more people who need encouragement. To hear more episodes, learn about our other mental health resources, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.